the Drive Nation podcast with Dan Prosser and Andrew Frankel.
We've got a jingle, Andrew.
Yay, a jingle. I never thought I'd live to see the day. I've got a jingle.
We're moving up in the podcast world slowly. Well, welcome everyone to episode 10 of the Drive Nation podcast. I'm Dan Prosser, talking again with Andrew Frankel.
I am Andrew Frankel. Hello, Dan. Hope you're well. What are we going to talk about today?
Well, this is part 2 of the Drive Nation navel gazing series. A few weeks ago, you and I, Andrew, we spoke at length about the art of road testing cars.
Yeah.
And during that podcast, we said that we'd talk about car journalism more broadly. So not just the specific discipline of assessing a car, but the industry, how we both got involved, how people should look at getting involved nowadays, how it's changed over the years, all that sort of stuff. So I think to get us started, can you give us a sort of précis of how you started off in car journalism? Presumably, Andrew, you wanted to get involved in it because, like me, you were just obsessed with car magazines.
I was absolutely obsessed with car magazines, literally from my earliest memory. But I never thought, I don't think I ever thought that I was going to be a car journalist, because to me, and this will give you some kind of insight into the sort of child and teenager I was. Car journalists were superstars. They were Hollywood A-listers. I mean, Set Wright and George Bishop and Steady Barker and Mel Nichols and Steve Cropley. I mean, these guys that I grew up with. I can remember, and I've told this story in print before, sitting in a burger bar with my father one day when a red 308 pulled up outside and Cropley got out of it and walked into the burger bar, and I basically turned puce, and my father said, "What on earth is the matter?" And I sort of started stammering and pointing. And my father's suggestion was, well, just go and say hello and say that you appreciate what he does. And honestly, he could have asked me to go and ask Barbara Bark out with a date, and he would have been less likely to get me to do it. I just couldn't. I could barely look at the man, because that's what motoring journalists were to me when I was that age. And it's a very long and fairly boring story, so I won't start telling it now. But I mean, I left school with no qualifications whatsoever because I was lazy, bone idle more like, and I did all sorts of things. I tried to become a lawyer, I did stuff in the city, and failed dismally at all of them. And it was only when a mate of my oldest brother's told him that Autocar were advertising in a thing called the Media Guardian for a junior road test assistant. And my brother, knowing that I was sort of sitting at home watching daytime telly, spiraling down into the abyss, he rang me up and he said, "You got to go for this." It was fun enough. It was kind of desperation, which made me look at something which I thought I never deserved or merited or would be any good at. And again, to cut a very long story short, I sort of lucked and lied my way into the job in 1988, and I've been doing it ever since.
So do you reflect on how you got that job? I mean, did you have any experience that you could sort of call on in the interview, for instance, or were you totally green?
No, I was completely green. I don't think I'd ever written anything for publication. I don't think I even wrote anything for a sort of school magazine or anything like that. I mean, I knew because it was my least worst A-level that I was better at English than anything else. But, a C is not exactly much to... after retakes, I got a D in English first time round. So a C in English is not exactly anything to shout about. No, I had no experience at all. What got me the job was Autocar phrased the advert badly. It's just one of those standard things, and they just ask people to send in their CVs. And because I was so late to it, because I never saw the paper, because funnily enough I wasn't reading The Guardian in 1988, I rang up. The only smart thing I did two smart things. One is I rang up and asked if the job was still available, and they said that it was, but only because they had X number of hundreds of applications and I hadn't started going through them. And the second smart, and the only truly smart thing I think I ever did in the entire process was say, is there anything I can do to make my application stand out a bit? That's when they told me they'd only asked for CVs, and they said, if you wrote something that would really help, because then at least we could see whether you could write or not. I couldn't even type. I could literally. But what I did have was I had another brother who was already sort of flying high in the property world, and he had a wonderful person called a secretary who could type. And so I wrote up some stuff about a Renault 5, which is I was knocking about in at the time, and she very kindly typed it up. I sent it in, and I got an interview. And that's how I got through the door. So do not try that approach today. It will not work. Yeah, so that's what saved me. It literally saved me. And yeah, I haven't looked back.
That's so interesting to hear you talk about the way you idolised car journalists when you were a kid, because it was exactly the same for me. Yeah, I remember Dickie Meadens and John Barkers and some bloke called Chris Harris, Steve. There's a Frankel bloke as well. I can't remember his first name.
Oh, sorry. There are two of us. There's another Andrew Frankel, and people who are really, really old may even know this other one. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just got to tell this story.
Go on.
So the other Andrew Frankel, he was the publisher with a wonderful bloke called Ian Fraser of Car Magazine back in the day, in the sort of 70s and 80s, and they had a thing called FF Publishing, and they published Car, and I knew this bloke because, Car was all I read. I devoured Car Magazine. Car Magazine, if you don't know, is the magazine that completely changed the face of motoring journalism in the 70s and 80s, with particularly under Doug Blaine, Mel Nichols, and Steve Cropley as its editors. And anyway, so the other Andrew Frankel didn't write anything, he just published it. But when he first saw my name in print, my first byline, he literally rang me up and told me to change my name.
And you didn't?
Finally, well, I mean, I was so completely dumbstruck by this. Obviously I was working at Autocar, and by that stage Mel Nichols was Haymarket's, which published Autocars, its editorial director. And so I knew, I was proud to be able to say I knew Mel Nichols a bit. So I just kind of knocked on his door and said, I've had this slightly strange conversation. And Mel just started laughing. It's not for me to divulge the nature of the relationship between the other Andrew Frankel and his the people who work for him in an editorial. But suffice to say, the advice was, don't worry about it, keep going. And I did. But anyway, so sorry, Dan. Keep going.
No, that's hilarious. Well, okay. So I absolutely identify with that old thing of idolising car journalists, which is a strange thing because, well, we're a strange bunch. But yeah, so I was just going to speak about how I got involved in it, because there might be a little, some sort of guidance in there for younger guys who are, or girls who are looking to get involved in car journalism today. I actually didn't go to university. I knew from a very young age, actually, that I wanted to work with cars. And I thought when I was a very young kid that I wanted to be a car designer. Sadly, it turned out I had zero artistic talent. So that was never going to happen for me. And then I realised, actually, writing about these things might be quite fun. I loved the car magazines. When I was adolescent, I was sort of Max Power era. It was a much more titillating car magazine than Autocar. Titillate, excuse the pun, and I would later progress onto Top Gear Mag and then Autocar, and the moment that I picked up those magazines, I just knew that I wanted to work for them one day, and so it was a bold move, but I decided that I probably didn't need to go to university to do this. When I was 18 or 19, I won a young rally journalist competition in motorsport news, which got me a foot in the door with then Haymarket's motorsport titles. So can we just rewind that slightly? So did you just attend a rally and send in a report on that rally sort of on spec? Is that how you won that? Well, do you know what? There's actually a little bit more to my story than that. So before then, I'd written a couple of pieces for Piston Heads, which was in its very early days back then, and they paid me 12 pence or something to write some nonsense about whatever. Anyway, I'd had a couple of pieces published.
But I'm sorry to keep on pressing the rewind button, but I think it must be really interesting for people who are thinking about becoming motoring journalists today, because, as I will say doubtless later on in this podcast, the thing to do is to get published. But these days, if people just ring up an editor or send in a story, it's quite unlikely to see the big wide world. So how did you persuade Piston Heads to publish your stuff?
Okay, let's rewind all the way back. So when I was, I guess, 16, 17, I just sent endless letters to all the editors of all the car magazines, and endlessly.
This is the important stuff.
And emails as well. And I don't even want to tell this story because it just makes me shudder to this day. But I was aware that Chris Harris lived in Bristol. I could tell from just reading Autocar magazine. I think he mentioned it quite a lot, or perhaps he explicitly said that he lived in Bristol, and that's where I grew up. And I knew what car he had at the time because he was writing about it in the magazine. And I saw this car that I recognised, an E36 M3, at Bristol Parkway Station. I saw it in the car park. I lived just around the corner from the train station then. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to, this is long before social media. Nowadays, you just fire off a tweet or something, don't you? But I saw his car in the car park, and I went home and I printed off a letter and I stuck it on the windscreen.
Oh, well done.
He, for years after I became his mate, he didn't mention it until we were drunk one evening, and he said, I remember many years ago I found a letter on my old M3, and I just had to walk away. I couldn't bear to hear him complete the anecdote. But anyway,
but that's what you've got to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you've got nothing to lose other than your dignity.
Yeah, well, I lost that several times. But yeah, I fired off letters, not just to the big magazines either, but to all the sort of single mark ones as well. And anyway, so so with Pistonheads, I managed to get published a couple of times. And this brings me to the Motorsport News competition, which wanted a couple of pieces that you'd written, perhaps just, as a mock article or anything that had been published somewhere. And then you had to submit an article for the competition specifically. I still have a mate, Adam, who was a very, very talented, promising young rally driver at the time. And I wrote, I can't remember what I wrote exactly, but I wrote a piece about him. And that was enough to win me this competition, which was enough to get me a foot in the door with the motorsport titles. And that was my kind of backdoor into the industry because, I was doing motorsport reports, and that was really, really solid experience. Now, motorsport journalism is a kind of, it's an old and a noble profession in its own right, so you have to treat it with respect. But I think, for me, certainly, that turned out to be a very effective way of getting into the industry because, frankly, there aren't so many people who want to go and stand in a freezing Welsh rally service park when it's misty and raining outside. And so when these titles find someone who's prepared to go and do that and is enthusiastic about it, I think they'll quite gladly have them on board. And so, anyway, long story short, I'd been doing a little bit of motorsport reporting, and that was just enough to get me an interview at a publishing company in Kent called Unity Media at the end of 2007, which was relaunching a magazine called Performance Car. I got the job and I was in. So I owe so much to so many people. Fluke, good fortune, happy timing, all played a huge part of it. But there's no doubt I worked really hard and determinedly to get into this industry.
That's the thing. You make your own luck, don't you?
Yeah.
And you what you did is, people so often say, how do you get into the industry? And you can go and do a journalism degree, you can go and do a car journalism degree, and I wouldn't suggest for a second that anybody shouldn't do that. But ultimately, it's about getting yourself noticed and doing what has to be done. Whether that is leaving a note on Chris Harris's windscreen or deluging somebody with emails, or the work experience thing. I have seen so many work experience people come and say that they really want to be motoring journalists, but they're always sort of a bit late in the office, and by 5:15 you can see they're itching to go, and they always do what you ask them to, but they're never proactive, and you just think you've got this opportunity. Let me tell you the story of Andrew Golby. It's possible that Andrew Golby will be listening to this. We used to call him Gold Boy. In fact, I think he still calls himself Gold Boy. He was a bloke who came to Autocar on work experience. And we just gave him the most terrible jobs. We were horrible to him, as we probably were to most work experience people. And he was the Energizer Bunny. There was nothing you could do to this bloke which he wouldn't emerge from with an even bigger smile on his face. We needed a Saab, which unfortunately was in Gothenburg at the time. And so we stuck him in appalling weather on a North Sea ferry for 24 hours. And literally the only driving he did was driving it from the quayside onto the boat. And then he came back again for another 24 hours and we collected it from that. And he was just, there was some launch going up in Scotland and there were lots of cars, but we didn't want them in Scotland. We wanted them down south. So we basically relayed him for a week. He'd fly up to wherever it was in Scotland in the morning, drive the car back to his parents lived in Warwickshire, I think, spend the night in Warwickshire, deliver the car to us at 7 o'clock in the morning, just in time to go back to the airport to fly back up to Scotland to go and get another one. And he did this day after day after day. And for him, he'd tell you that he was having a wonderful time. He was being paid to drive cars. And at the end of it, we just realised we can't lose this bloke. He's just too good. So we actually created a job for him. And he went on to be, far more senior than me. He ended up, I think, publishing the thing and then disappearing off into the industry and, he was on his way. So that's what you can do if it means enough to you. And the other thing I would say is if it doesn't mean enough to you, for God's sake, don't do it, because it's just not worth it. It has to be your absolute passion. You have to be, frankly, Dan, like you and I were. It has to be, the dream of a lifetime to do it.
Yeah, it really does. Can you remember what your starting salary was on an Autocar? I'll tell you what mine was at Performance Car.
Yeah, but I'm 1,000 years older than you. My starting salary at Autocar was £7,500 a year.
Wow, I feel quite flush then on my £14,000 a year.
Yeah, I bet it hasn't gone up much since then.
Well, no, that's sort of the problem, isn't it? I think that's something to bear in mind. If you are looking to get involved in the industry and you're starting right at the bottom, perhaps as a graduate or in your early 20s, you're not going to get paid much at all. I moved from Bristol to Kent for a 14 grand salary, and I stayed on that sort of money. It perhaps crept up, but I stayed on that sort of money for 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, absolutely. and the people who are going in now will not be paying. I mean, I'm not completely familiar with what people, new road testers or office assistants or whatever get paid, but it's, it is not something. And even if you go on, you rise up through the ranks, maybe you end up editing something, and you go freelance through choice rather than a circumstance. And even if you work really, really hard and you make a decent name for yourself, you're never going to be rich. The only way to get rich out of being a motoring journalist is to have some other skill, and make it on telly, and be a Clarkson or a May or a Hammond. And then, yes, you'll make money. But, the number of us compared to the number of them, I mean, it is vanishingly unlikely that you will ever become a wealthy person being a motoring journalist. And that's another thing you've got to look squarely in the eye. Because if you, I think the problem is that the disparity between our perceived standard of living or quality of life perhaps and what it actually is simply colossal. Because yes, I mean, there are occasions, and they are the occasions that people tend to read about, where we, swan off around the world and drive, fast cars in exotic places. And I think there's a kind of sort of natural association with it. But I think if the people who read those sort of stuff could go and look at, the average accommodation for a 25-year-old road tester, you would see someone who was not living that life at all, or anything near it. It's a really, really weird thing to contemplate, but it is what it is, I guess.
That's a very good point. There's this weird sort of paradox in car journalism in that you will stay in some of the best hotels in the world. You will also stay in some of the most appalling places in the world, and it depends if there's a car manufacturer putting you up. It'll be a great hotel.
What's the worst place you ever stayed?
Well, it was, so if it's the magazine that you're working for paying for the hotel, it'll be terrible, generally speaking. There was one up near the Yorkshire Moors, North York Moors, I think, and it was just a room above a pub, and I was sharing with another person in a tiny room, 2 single beds, with the bathroom door hanging off its hinges, and it was just terrible. Couldn't really be sure that the sheets were clean, and it's and you're sort of lying in that bed thinking, I'm sure 2 weeks ago I was at the Ritz-Carlton in the Middle East somewhere with my own little compound with a private pool, and you think, what's gone wrong?
I once had a butler.
Who was paying for that?
It was. I think it was Maybach. It was somewhere in the Middle East. I'm not true. I didn't have a butler. I had 2 butlers. I had a day and a night butler. At this ridiculous place. Needless to say, I didn't avail myself of the services of either, but I was led to understand that they were there to do whatever I required of them. I also stayed in a hotel which had a 4-car garage, at the same time I can also remember staying in. One of the things that manufacturers tend to do is, or have done, is book sort of interesting and different places. If you ask a motoring journalist what he wants from a hotel room, he will tell you he wants a room that is clean, a room with a comfortable bed and functioning Wi-Fi so he or she can work. That's it. Full stop, period. Nothing else matters. Yeah. They put me on one of the hottest days Europe's ever seen in a monastery. Literally in a monk's cell. I think it was a Peugeot launch. It was a long time ago, and the only thing that it had going for it was the fact that it was a twin room, so it had 2 tiny single beds. But I can remember, this is slightly disgusting actually, but I can remember lying in one and sweating until, I was in such an appalling state. I had to go and have a shower in the middle of the night, but then I could get into the other bed. It's sort of, they kind of missed the point there, didn't they?
I mean, just important.
Completely. It's a working job, and we're there to work, and everything should be configured. And to work, you need to be able to sleep, and you need to be able to function, and nothing else matters.
Maserati once put me up in a hotel in Monaco, the Hermitage.
Oh, yes.
And it had the Grand Prix wasn't on, but it had a view down onto the Grand Prix circuit. And it had a rate card on the back of the door.
Go on.
And I had a quick look at it, and I realised, so that's 2 months' salary
for one night.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's just absolutely, completely unnecessary is what it is, really. I mean, I suppose the point of that is that no, sadly, it's very, very unlikely to make you a wealthy person, but you will quite often get to do things that if you weren't a car journalist, you would have to be a wealthy person to be able to afford to do.
Or even if you were a wealthy person, may well simply not be able to do. You've done things, Dan. I've done things that, it's just not available to anybody, pretty much. And that is one of the inestimable privileges of doing the job, because particularly things like, being first to stuff. I don't know why it matters, but it does. And getting into a car and thinking that I am the first person outside this factory to have driven this thing. And it's it's stuff that you remember. And if you're a certain sort of weird kind of person like I am and you are, this sort of rubbish matters.
It really does. Can you, off the top of your head, can you pull out one money can't buy experience? I'll tell you mine while you're thinking.
Go on.
This was back in, I think it's 2015, when the current Audi R8 was new. This was before the media launch, so no one really had driven it. And we were at Le Mans, and an hour before the start of the race, I drove a new R8 for a lap around Le Sarthe in front of 250,000 people.
There you go.
And it was, just what an incredible thing to get to be able to do.
Yeah. Okay, I thought of one.
Go on.
I guess it would have been 5 years ago. He and I talk about this frequently because we still can't believe it happened. Harris and I went to Weissach. Weissach is not a public facility. You cannot get on. I don't care who you are. You can't get onto Weissach. It's one of the most secretive closed facilities that there is, where Porsche provided not only the 1987 Le Mans winning 962C, but also Norbert Singer. And Norbert, who is basically God in Porsche world, who is also one of the nicest people I've ever met. Here was the car, and as has happened with other Porsche things that I have done, You just get in the car and you drive it. They never say, oh, don't use this many revs, or you've only got that many laps, or, we'll keep off the curves, or, watch this, watch that. They just give you the car. And all I can tell you is that when we got the car, they put it on a brand new set of cut slicks. And by the time we finished with it, they were cut no more. We'd literally completely done driving this thing as fast as we could around the Weissach test track. And then we just sat down and spent 2 hours downloading Norbert. I mean, yeah, you can't buy that, can you? It's a simply extraordinary experience.
Yeah, one of the greatest privileges is meeting people that you've idolised, and in some cases they become your bloody friends.
Yes.
I'm thinking yourself and Sir Sterling Moss.
Yeah. No, it is absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah. All that stuff makes it sound like it's a wonderful way to make a living, and people should rush towards it. But the truth of it is, isn't it, Andrew, that the thing that you have to want to be more than anything else is a writer.
Correct. Absolutely. I mean, I've always said to people who've asked, it's a weird kind of skill set, because there are 3 non-negotiable, can I call them talents? Abilities that you need. I can't really do anything other than these 3 things. But you need to be able to drive to the required standard, and that doesn't mean you need to be Lewis, but you need to be good enough to be able to control a car sufficiently near its limit to be able to give your reader a reliable impression of what that car is like in all handling conditions. That is, you can't do the job without that. You then need to be able to communicate. You need to be able, so you need to be able to write. And again, you don't have to be Hemingway, but you need to be able to write, very, very, huge numbers of words. We write an awful lot, and you have to be able to write consistently to the required standard. But between those 2 poles is you have to be able to interpret. You have to be able to understand what the car is saying to you in order to be able to write it down. I was taught, one of the reasons that I left school with no exams worthy of the mention is not only because I was so indolent, but also because I was taught by people who knew everything but could communicate nothing. And it's, you have to have that too. So you have to be able to understand what the car is saying to you, and then you have to be able to put it down. But you're absolutely right. If one of those 3 things was the most important, it would be the writing. We're not paid to drive cars. We're paid to write English. And the funny thing is, over the years, and some people may be appalled by this, I definitely got into it because it was a way of being paid to drive cars, and I make no apology for that. I still love driving as much as I ever did. But if forced to give up one or the other, I'd give up cars in a heartbeat.
Wow. Yeah, that's a statement.
Yeah. To me, when it's working well, when I feel that by my own limited standards I'm writing okay, there's nothing in the world I'd rather be doing. It is the most wonderful, wonderful feeling, and I cherish it, frankly, because it's quite rare. Usually, and almost all writers will tell you this, even very well established, famous, and well rewarded writers will tell you that it's a struggle. Writing is hard. It's lonely and it's hard, and that's something else you've got to be able to get your head around too. But sometimes it is the most wonderful thing in the world.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, I was going to ask you about this a bit later on, but it's relevant now, and it applies not just to what we do, but to any sort of journalism. Given how much you love the process of writing and how much energy and effort you put into it, how do you feel when a sub-editor or an editor hacks into your copy?
Oh, golly. This is the sort of thing that journalists, we don't really get pissed on launches anymore, but we used to because we had the time to, and then just start getting really, really dark and whinging at each other relentlessly about what some bastard back in the office has done to your story. The truth is that sub-editors are brilliant, and sub-editors have dug me out of so many more holes than they have dug for me. And the amount, particularly if I've been working for newspapers, the way they fact check things, sub-editors, and if people don't know, sub-editors are basically the safety net between the writer and the printed page, and they make sure that everything fits, everything's spelt correctly, you haven't said anything stupid, you haven't said anything libelous, and also part of their remit is if they think of a way in which your words could be better expressed, they have a certain amount of latitude to rewrite your words too, although we don't particularly like that. But inevitably, they make mistakes too. I was whinging, I think on Twitter recently, about I'd written somewhere that a car handles like a Mark II Escort, and by the time it appeared on the printed page, it had become a Mark III Escort. Now, anybody knows their Escorts know that Mark II Escorts are the most wonderful things in the world, and Mark III Escorts are barely worthy of a mention. So, that sort of thing happens. I get very annoyed by that, but I also, there are times when you might try really, really hard with something, with a piece, and to really try to communicate the emotion of a moment and that sort of thing, and there's a bit of your heart on the page there, and then when I say on the page, sort of, in your typewriter or your laptop or whatever, but by the time you see it on the page, it's just been sort of diluted, it's been watered down, because there's some sub-editor who doesn't feel the same way as you, thinks you're probably being slightly florid, and just thinks, well, we'll just dial it back a bit. And that's quite painful too. It's not as painful as a Mark II Escort becoming a Mark III Escort, but it's it's happened to you, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think it's probably happened to everyone who's had a byline. It can be frustrating, but it's just part of it, I suppose. And the reality is, the person commissioning it or sub-editing it has a very clear idea of what the title wants, and as long as they keep coming back to you for more work, you have to let them make the changes that they feel are necessary. Yeah,
to a great extent. I used to do a lot of stuff for the Sunday Times, and I don't anymore, for various reasons. But they used to. Sometimes I'd write something and it would come out, and it would be pretty close to what I'd written. Sometimes you'd be reading it and you think, well, my name's on it, but that's literally the only thing I recognise in here. And you would, you sometimes you think, well, the only reason they've actually asked me to do this is because they wanted a story about the car and they couldn't get access to it any other way. And then you've written the story, and then they've completely ignored it and rewritten it with your name into the story they wanted it to be. And I found that, now to be fair, they wouldn't do things like change a verdict from negative to positive or change star ratings or anything else. So, I mean, essentially, the verdict that you intended would be in there somewhere. So they wouldn't change the actual meaning of it, but everything else could be completely rewritten. And as a writer, that is, I really struggled with why they did that, because what better way to completely demoralise your writer and to make sure that the next piece he or she writes for you is not as good because they've tried less hard, because they think to themselves, what's the bloody point if you're just going to change it? I might as well just give in notes. So, but I've only really ever had that with newspaper journalism, and in fact, although I've written for a few newspapers, I've only really had it with the Sunday Times. I've done quite a bit of stuff for the Telegraph over the years, and they're usually, they might trim it a bit just because it's got to fit a certain space, and maybe you've overwritten a little bit or whatever. But otherwise, they're really pretty good at printing what you write.
Oh, just imagine all those creative strops car journalists have had over the years, many of them my own. Okay, well let's just try and stop grumbling about that stuff and grumble about something else. When do you think the heyday of motoring journalism was, and how far are we from that now?
That's a really interesting question, Dan, because I've never really thought. Okay, it depends how you define the heyday. Okay.
Yeah.
If you define it, and any road testers listening to this will understand entirely what I mean by this, by the amount of cocking about we used to do with cars, and the amount of really, really stupid stuff that we used to do, I would say I was blessed, because the heyday for that was probably the early 1990s. I did basically 90% of the really stupid stuff I'd done in cars I did between 1990 and 1994. And that was back in the days when people had budget and they could afford to let you try and drive a Ford Mondeo 12,000 miles in a week, or if you had and so somebody came out with a new tyre, they'd go and hire a test track in the south of France and send you down there with the tyre for a week with every other rival tyre, and you'd spend a week skidding around the Miraval test track with oodles of tyres and just having all the fun in the world. So I would say that was the heyday, but it's different now. I mean, yes, of course, you used to write more words then, and there was certainly more time. You could be much more considered about your verdicts, but actually, I think that now is as interesting a time to be a motoring journalist, because the industry in which we report is in a state of flux, the likes of which we've never seen. And to sit here and, I don't think we ever spent much time pondering the future of the car, because it was always going to be better versions of what we already had. Now, we can't take that for granted anymore. And I think that it may not be as much fun, but I think it's even more interesting now, just being a motoring journalist. And I think the frustration sometimes that we feel is that we don't get either the space on the page or the time in our heads to really consider these issues and to write about them the way that we would like to, because nobody commissions 3,000 word stories anymore. Nobody says, oh, that's fine, get it to us at the end of next month. That's just not the way the industry works anymore. Everything has to be done yesterday. And that, well, as you will know, that brings its frustrations and it brings its constraints, and what it means is that, usually speaking, what appears on the page isn't as good as it could be if you'd had the time to really consider it and craft it. But nobody's got time to wait for journalists to peer into the middle distance, and try to think of the perfect construction for every sentence.
Chin.
Yeah, exactly. We can't do that. So so it's a very long answer to a very short question, but I think it's an art that moves. I think what has changed are, and perhaps you should talk more about this than me, because you are much more across this stuff than I am. The skills that are required to be a modern motoring journalist. I mean, really, when I started, as long as you could drive a bit, understood what the car said, and write it down, you were a motoring journalist. These days, particularly with video and that sort of thing, it's a completely different ballgame, isn't it?
Well, we're demonstrating it right now, Andrew.
Yeah.
We've said ourselves that as a car journalist, first and foremost, you're a writer. But actually, there is a bit more to it than that, because if you're on staff on a magazine these days, you will more or less be expected to put your face on camera, and you might well contribute to a podcast. You'll be across social media. It's become sort of a multidiscipline vocation, hasn't it? There are now many facets to it.
Yeah. Now, so do you think that means, because nobody can be good at everything? Well, some people can, and they're just really annoying, like Harris. But because he can present and he can write and he can drive, and it's just infuriating. But for most people, do you think that to accommodate the fact that people have to be much more broadly defined, therefore a little less depth, you can get away with being perhaps not quite as good a writer, or maybe not quite as good a presenter in front of a camera than somebody who maybe does it on telly? Do you think that there's basically an acceptance in the industry that to be able to do all these things, there is going to be a little bit, people just have to be a bit flexible in their thinking about it?
I think you're probably right about that. I think you are. And I think another thing that's changed is that there was a time where the industry was robust enough, perhaps, or where it was a sort of grand enough profession that it would attract people who were, by any measure, exceptionally talented writers.
Yeah.
Very talented writers would choose to turn that talent to car journalism.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if that happens now, or if it does happen, does it happen to anything like the same extent as it used to?
I think there are still some really, really talented writers out there. I mean, one of the things that I've given thanks for, I'm about to contradict myself, over the years, is I always thought that by the time I got to the age I am now, that I'd have been replaced, because we were certainly, when I was your age, we were replacing the people who were my age. But I think because people have grown up in a different world where there is so much more out there to distract them and to interest them, things that we never had, I think there are just fewer really good car journos coming through, because people who might otherwise have gone into the business may have gone off and done something else which simply didn't exist back then. So there are fewer people coming through, but there are some, there are some terrific writers, young, talented people coming through, and I'm frankly, I shouldn't be. I should feel threatened by it, but I'm not. I give thanks for it, because it means that this wonderful living that we have, still has some life left in it. How much, I don't know, but I think it'll be enough to see me out. I hope it'll be enough to see you out. And yeah, but it's an interesting point, isn't it?
I wonder as well, what this new digital era and this sort of fragmented media landscape. We've got, never mind just countless editorial websites now. We've also got individual groups on Facebook, and we've got social media accounts, and we've got YouTube channels. And on top of all of that, we've got the whole influencer phenomenon. So I feel like the old audience for automotive media content has been fragmented across all these different places. And if you think that's the case as well, Andrew, what has that done to the authority of the old, long-established print magazines?
I hope it's increased it, because I think people understand quality when they read it. I think, I don't think you can fake, for instance, verdicts that have been arrived at with by people who are experienced and who have had time to thought about it and have done that sort of thing quite a bit in the past. And I think that if I wanted to read what a new car was like, I'd just go and read one of the established magazines, because I know that although people, particularly for freelance like we are, we tend to write all over the place, but the best writers will still have a presence in those titles. And so if I wanted to make sure that I was most likely to get a reliable verdict, and we all know the names. We all know the names of the people who we think, yeah, okay, if they say this car is great or a piece of crap or whatever, then that's good enough for me. What you tend not to find are people like that who don't have any kind of presence in print. Present company accepted, but I'd still go and revert to the magazines, because I think that's where they are. So I hope the answer to your question is that the authority is augmented by the fracturing that you're talking about. But I don't know. What do you think?
It was very interesting to hear you, sort of describe your position on it. I think you're right. I have a sense that the sheer size of the audience has diminished. I mean, we know that to be true because circulation figures are way down, but breadth of reach is not the same as authority. It used to be the case that if you wanted to find out about the latest car or read a review about whatever, you would go and buy a magazine, or maybe you'd wait for a TV show to pop up about it. But really those were your options, weren't they? But nowadays, if you've got a keyboard, you can create content about cars, and if you can ultimately work to a point where you've got access to the cars, you can build an audience as big or bigger than the ones that you and I have.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that your verdicts are worth reading. Or they might be worth reading because there might be really interesting pieces of writing, but it doesn't mean that means that the verdict is reliable. I mean, as we know, briefly treading into influencer world, that they will write whatever they're paid to write about a car, and that's fine as long as people understand that what they're reading is advertorial. Then no worries. But please don't tell me that that people should go and buy those cars on the basis of that, because that's ridiculous. It's not an objective verdict, arrived at by an impartial judge. It's a bit of puff that's been written by someone who's paid to write it. And fair play. I don't have the problem with the influences that some people do, because I just don't think that the people who spend that sort of money on those sorts of cars are going to buy what they peddle. I think it's a form of entertainment, I guess. It's certainly a form of advertising, but it's not what we do. I only have trouble with it when, for instance, car manufacturers start replacing journalists with influencers on car launches. You and I know that, there are, particularly with small exotic car manufacturers, they can't invite 1,000 people to drive any given car. And if they've got 10 places for UK media and 3 of those go to influencers or 4 of them go to influencers, well, that's 3 or 4, potentially really good journalists and 3 or 4 really good, reliable verdicts, which aren't going to get written because, they'd rather pay an influence to write something entirely, positive and non-contentious.
Mm. Yeah, I agree, and it's a scenario, isn't it, really, where us sort of more traditional car journalists might have to do something that doesn't come naturally to any of us, but perhaps comes naturally to certain other groups, and self-promote and point out why an authoritative, reliable, independent verdict is so vital to the consumer. Completely,
and always will be. So yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and it's not just the consumer, because I don't really regard myself as a consumer journalist.
No, you're right.
I have a lot of time and admiration for consumer journalists, but whether you're going to buy a car or not, you still want to know what it's like.
Yeah, we write for the enthusiasts as much as anything, don't we?
Yeah, but you don't have to. You don't be sticking your hand in the pocket to want to know that what you are reading is. Okay, it's clearly all opinion, so I suppose you shouldn't really couch it in terms of right or wrong, but at least, you want to know that it is, independently arrived at an honest assessment of the car as seen on the day. And I think that always has been important and always will be important.
I think while we're talking about car journalism as a profession, it's probably helpful to point out that there are lots of different ways to be a car journalist, because we've mostly been talking about road testing, which is actually just one part of it. You might also be a consumer journalist, as we've mentioned, or a news journalist, or you might be very sort of industry focused. And then there's the sort of more creative side of it. You might be best known as a feature writer. Is there any one aspect of car journalism that has sort of appealed to you most? Presumably it's road testing.
Well, yes. Although it depends. Again, it depends what you mean by road testing. If you mean proper road testing, that's something. I mean, I go and assess cars these days. I go and I do what I call first drives. It's been a long time since I've done what I call a thorough road test, which is as you say, a thorough, analytical, science-based approach to evaluating a car. That's what I used to spend all my time doing back on the days in auto car. I really like news, actually. I just could never find a way of earning a living at it as a freelancer. You just don't get, people will say, oh, well, yeah, that's a really good story. Let's have 300 words. Well, you and I know what the word rates are. I can't survive on 300 words. So, I mean, I would, if I could find a way of making it pay, I'd do more news, because I do actually, although I think that motor shows are totally outdated, outmoded, dinosaurs, I do enjoy, particularly one-on-one, sitting down with, somebody with something interesting to say, and, I getting the old deer stalker out and trying to ferret a bit of news out of them. I do find that process quite, it also takes me out of my comfort zone a bit, which I also enjoy. I think that, it's very easy if you're a road tester just to spend your life driving cars and writing about them. And I think it's quite easy to get jaded and lazy and blah. So, but I mean, ultimately, yes. What I love doing is driving cars and writing about them. Frankly, it's the only thing I've ever proved to be any good at all.
Okay, well, let's, as we start to wind this down a bit, let's have a think about how it's changing now, car journalism, and what the future of it might look like. I mean, it's you and I, Andrew, we're trying ourselves to sort of implement some of the core, the fundamentals of car journalism to new platforms. We're doing it right now on a podcast, and we've got Drive Nation at @DriveNation_ on Instagram, where we're trying to apply good, robust car journalism to a new social media platform. I mean, it's actually odd, isn't it, that you and I thought that was a good idea and that we think it's worth doing.
It is, but you can't live in the past. I mean, much as I'd certainly love to. You can't do that, and also although you naturally feel, resistance to these things, when you go and do them, of course, like all new things, as long as they are fundamentally worthwhile, they're interesting, and it's fun finding out. I mean, unlike you, I'd barely heard of Instagram when you first came to me and said, "What do you reckon?" And it's been a really, really interesting process. I mean, for me, I've, most of the stuff I do is for magazines and websites, which involve just writing articles and that sort of thing. But I've also, I've knocked out a couple of quite big books in the last couple of years, and I do these tiny, tiny, tiny little stories on Drive Nation, which is probably the most challenging bit of it all, because as you will know, it's far harder to write 300 words than 3,000 words, and still manage to inform and entertain at the same time. And I find that absolutely fascinating, and to be able to write everything from a 70,000 word book to a 300 word DN story is, it's variety of the spice of life, isn't it? But looking further forward, I think it's very easy to be sort of, down in the mouth about it and go, oh, it ain't what it used to be, and, back in my day, this, that, and the other. But I think they will, I think people will always love cars. I hope so. I think the internal combustion engine will still be around for, some considerable time to come. And by the time it goes, who knows, maybe there'll be something else which we can get enthused about, or maybe they'll find a way of making electricity interesting. I don't know. But, I think that driving cars and reporting on cars, if you're a certain sort of person, and I cannot stress too much that you have to be, it can't be something that you do on a whim, or you think, oh, that might be a fun thing to do. It has to be something that you feel deep within you. Then if you can't find something interesting to write about, then you're in the wrong business. I mean, you and I know that, we have to come up with something to put on Drive Nation every single day. And at the moment, when there's no news and there are no cars to drive, you might think, and I might have all thought to myself, oh, this is going to be a bit tricky. We've got 8, 10, 12 weeks of nothing. How are we going to fill it? We haven't thought about it. There's just stuff to do, isn't there? If you have the passion and you have the interest, you may look at back memory lane, or you may have, strong views about something, or there may be some little snippet of news that comes out and you can spin something out of that. There will always be a way to write. And I think it's always been that way. It is that way, and it will remain that way.
Yeah. I've had so much fun over the last 12 years or something. And I think if you really stick at it and work hard and make a good name for yourself, there's a decent living to be made. We've already mentioned that you won't be rich, but you're not going to be, on the breadline for your 40-year career either. And just the opportunities, the fun you have, the people you meet. God, I actually wouldn't change it for anything.
No, not me. I mean, I've always said this. I think so often I think I sound quite down about people becoming motoring journalists, because I know how hard it is these days. But I'm not down about it. I'd only be down about it for someone who I didn't think was right for it. And I think that most people aren't right for it. I think if you are right for it, it is still the best job in the world. I cannot think of a way within any sense of likelihood or reason that I could have been more happily employed and earned a living than the one that I managed to luck and lie my way into all those years ago. And I feel absolutely blessed to have done it, and to still be doing it, and to hope still to be doing it many years from now.
Well, we all hope you are as well. All right, well, let's leave it there. Thank you everyone for listening. As ever, please do remember to subscribe to the Drive Nation podcast wherever you get them. Leave a rating, leave some feedback as well. Keep listening in. Andrew, how much car journalism are you doing at the moment?
Well, I'm doing quite a bit actually. I obviously have DN to keep me fairly occupied, and and not exclusively, but on the whole, my clients have been really, really good to me. Some have said business as usual. Some have said, okay, well, all our staff had to take a 20% pay cut. Would you mind doing the same for the duration of this? But people have by and large been very understanding. So, I feel very lucky, but, I obviously haven't got out and driven anything. Although on Tuesday, which is today, isn't it?
I know what you're going to say. Go on.
Do you? I'm going to go and drive a 911 Turbo S. And, you know, honestly, I don't think I've been this excited since my last child was born.
I'm doing it on Thursday.
Oh, okay. So, well, I'm going to beat you to it. So I'm just, So actually, I say Tuesday. It's actually if you're listening to this on the day it comes out, then today, maybe even while you're listening to this, I am wanging around somewhere in a 911 Turbo S, and to me that's sort of like, you know, the starting gun on, you know, hopefully our post-COVID lives, or starting to get back to that. So yeah, I'm so excited about that.
Me too. Okay, all right. Well, let's end it there. Thank you everyone for listening, and Andrew, as ever, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Dan. It's been a good one.
Speak soon.
The Drive Nation podcast with Dan Prosser and Andrew Frankel.